Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone to this, I almost said episode, close, but not quite, to this next session of this 4-part class with Rabbi David Silber, The Snake in the Garden. Sadly, next week will be our last class for this particular class, for this particular session, but there will always be more with Drisha, thank God. So we ask that those of you joining us here on Zoom, if you feel at all inclined to share your video so we can have the feeling of a more normal, real life classroom, it's highly appreciated. But of course, do keep yourself muted unless you're meaning to talk during a moment where we're having questions, answers, group discussion. If you prefer to use the chat, you are, of course, welcome to do so. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can put comments below the video there. If you're joining us on Drisha Live, hi, we're glad that you're learning with us. And with regards to text, of course, you are always welcome to look in your own Tanakh or other books that you might have on hand in your personal library. I will share text on screen, and I will do my best to keep up with putting fresh links in the chat to move us along as we work through different texts. And without further ado, Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get right to it. The nachash, the serpent, the snake, has, one might say, enticed the Isha and coaxed, enticed, influenced, and she eats of the forbidden fruit. She gives Adam as well, who's with her, Isha Asher Ima, and this will result in the banishment from Eden. The banishment from Eden is described at the end of the 3rd chapter. Vayigaresh et Adam, the human being is banished from Eden, and at the entrance to Eden, God places the kruvim with the flaming swords. To God, the path to the tree of life. God's concern, as described at the end of chapter 3, was that now the human may, in fact, partake of the tree of life, and live forever, and in doing so will be godlike, because the human is already godlike, having knowledge of good and evil. That's what happens in the story of the nachash, Garden of Eden. And I suggested, we talked about different possible ways to understand the nachash, but I guess the one I was pushing for the most is the idea that the nachash's desire is to disrupt God's plan. The nachash, as I suggested, the primary target of the nachash is not the human. Human is merely represents God or is a beneficiary of God. But the anger is directed more at God, because why has God singled out the human being, given the human special privileges in the garden, for example, to eat of the fruit? The animals were not permitted to eat any fruit. So the nachash resents that and sets out to disrupt God's plan of having a special relationship in a special space in which God and the human inhabit. And at the end of the day, actually, if you think about it, the nachash is successful. The nachash, in fact, has disrupted God's plan. The human being is banished forever from Eden. And the search then goes on throughout the book of Breshit, and one might say the Bible in general, to find alternative sacred space. That was the point I was pushing for. We suggested 2 other possibilities for the snake as well. And what's interesting is when God confronts the nachash and Adam and Chava, as she's named later, when God confronts them. So God, when it comes to the human beings, at least when it comes to Adam, God says to Adam, Kishamata b'kol ishtecha, you listen to your wife, hearken to her instead of hearkening to me, and therefore there's a punishment. And to the woman also, but initially, when God first speaks to the humans, God engages them in conversation. Ayeka, where are you? And then after Adam answers, we're hiding because we're naked. How do you know that you're naked? Did you eat of that fruit? So God gives Adam, and I presume by extension, Isha, an opportunity to say something. When it comes to, and their excuses, of course, are to blame somebody else. Adam blames the Isha and blames God implicitly. The Isha says, nachash, hishiani. So they don't take responsibility for what they did, but they had an opportunity. They had the opportunity. When it comes to the nachash, there's no opportunity to say anything. God simply said to nachash, ki asita zot, because you did this, you are to be punished. And to the humans, God had said, me'asita, what have you done? But to the nachash, there's no me'asita. You did this, and therefore you are punished. And it's interesting that the punishment, as described in chapter 3, verse number 14, Chiasito zot, orurato mikol habeimo mikol chayat hasadeh, al b'choncha telech, v'yafor tochal kol yimei chayecha. So you will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all of your life. You are cursed. V'yeva ashit beincha uvein ha'isha. And I will place eva ashit, I will place anger, hatred between you and the woman. Hu yeshuv charosh v'ata teshufenu uvein zaracha uvein zara, and between her and her descendants, the woman's children, that means the human beings, all of whom emerge ultimately from Chava. The human being yeshuv charosh v'ata teshufenu, they will strike you in the head, and you will strike them at the heel. So what's interesting is here, the nachash is described as the eternal enemy of the human being. Not just you and the Isha, but bein zaracha uvein zara, you are the eternal enemy of the human being. And if my suggestion is correct, the anger of the nachash is directed at God, because it's God who favored the human. So actually, one might say in the story, in the description of the Garden of Eden, the nachash has actually two adversaries. One is God, because nachash set himself up essentially as a counter to God. And of course, and the nachash enters into war with God. And the nachash, one might say, in a certain sense, defeats God, because the nachash succeeds. And of course, the nachash secondary target, but an important target, is God's favorite one. And that, of course, is the human being. From this perspective, just to repeat what I mentioned the last couple of weeks, if this interpretation is correct, then actually the nachash can be seen very much to be parallel to the story of Cain and Hevel. There, the God favors one over the other, and the one who's not favored resents it. Why is God favoring Hevel? After all, says Cain, or thinks Cain, I was the first one to bring the sacrifice. He just imitates me. Then we have a similar story with Yaakov and Esav, that there Yitzchak had intended to bless the older son, to bless Esav, and Yaakov, one might say, takes his blessing. Then you have Yosef and the brothers. So we have this rivalry between siblings, wanting the affection of a father figure, or in the case of God, God is the father figure, I suppose. So from that perspective, one could read the story of Gan Eden as parallel to many of the other sibling stories in the book of Breshit. So I mention this now in any event for a different reason, because what interests us, I think, is not just the nachash in the Garden of Eden, the snake in the garden, but what's actually very important is how the nachash plays out through the rest of the Torah and the rest of the Bible. Because the nachash, the serpent, okay, that's the nachash, but there are other snake-like figures throughout the Bible. The most prominent of them, clearly, that is to say, the one who was the eternal enemy of Israel, and I would add the eternal enemy of God, is of course Amalek. And not only is Amalek the eternal enemy of Israel and the eternal enemy of God, and it's actually very interesting that where Amalek appears in the Torah, Amalek appears a few times in the Torah, but most prominently, Amalek appears really as an adversary in the second half of chapter 17 of the book of Exodus. And then Amalek appears at the very end of the 25th chapter of the book of Dvarim. Parsha we know as Parshat Zochar. Zocharit asher asor Amalek b'derech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim. In the first parsha, that is Exodus 17b, let's call it, there Amalek is primarily God's enemy. As the Torah says, Milchamor Hashem b'Amalek b'dar dar. So God has an eternal war against Amalek in every generation. That's in Exodus. But in Deuteronomy, the Torah says, remember what Amalek did to you. Don't forget that. And so these two parshiot in the Torah, one might say, each one is primarily addressing, the first one primarily sees Amalek as God's enemy. And the second one seems to primarily see Amalek as the enemy of Israel. Of course, in the story in the Garden of Eden, I would say Amalek is God's enemy. Not Amalek, the snake is God's enemy. The snake is also humanity's enemy. It's not just Israel. There is no Israel at this point, but the enemy of the human being. The Amalek is, what makes Amalek more complicated is that Amalek is not just the enemy of God and of humanity. It's important to remember that Amalek is the enemy of humanity, but Amalek specifically is another side to Amalek, and that's Amalek is the enemy of the Jewish people, because Amalek himself is Esau's grandson. So Amalek is both God's enemy, but perhaps humanity's enemy, as described in Breshit, the beginning of the book, but also, of course, specifically, they may dislike all of humanity, but they start with the Jews for whatever reason. That's how it plays out in various texts of the Bible. And just to refresh our memories, Amalek acts in a snake-like fashion because they attack you at the weakest point. In fact, it's actually very interesting that there is a literary effect that we find in the Torah, which actually reminds us that Amalek is an instantiation of the nachash. I made this point in my book on the Megillah, and it's the text of the Amalek passage in the book of Devarim, will be known as Parshat Zochar. We are reminded, and we read this, of course, the Shabbat before Purim, Parshat Zochar, and the Torah says, Zocharit asher asacha Amalek. It's Deuteronomy chapter 25, the last verses. Remember what Amalek did to you, Baderech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim. Baderech, when you were traveling on the road, Baderech. Generally speaking, traveling on the road is dangerous because you have no place. Your transitional moments are always dangerous. So you were traveling on the derech, Baderech. Asher korcha baderech, they encountered you on the path. Torah repeats that. And then we have the very interesting and difficult verse, which is chapter 25 of Deuteronomy, Dvarim, chapter 25, verse number 18. Asher korcha baderech, vayizanev b'cha kol hanechash olim acharecha, v'yato oyev v'yogeya, v'lo yorei Elohim. Very difficult verse. Vayizanev b'cha kol hanechash olim acharecha. So this translation assumes that v'lo yorei Elohim, it's a question to whom does that refer? Does it refer to Amalek, they were not God-fearing? Or does it refer to Israel? They attacked you when you were not God-fearing. But what's interesting is, Vayizanev b'cha kol hanechash olim acharecha. What does nachash olim mean? Very strange word, nachash olim. So presumably, what it means is chalashim, the weak ones, or the stragglers. They cut you down, they surprised you. On the road, when you were ayef, you were tired, or hungry, weak. But they attacked you, and they cut down the stragglers in your rear. That's how the translation has it here. What's interesting is two things. First of all, that nachash, presumably, which means chalashim, but nachash, the word nachash is a literary effect. Because nachash, within the word nachash, of course, we have the word nachash. And not just the word nachash, but we have something else. Vayizalev b'cha nachash acharecha. But a zanav, of course, is a tail. One might say a snake is it's all tail. Snake is, right? That's what a snake is. So there is here a literary effect. I remember when I wrote the Megillah book, there was a review of it. He liked, he didn't like. And he said, this guy, he makes a big deal about, he makes a whole fuss about Amalek being the snake because it says nachash. I thought it was a joke. Totally misunderstanding my point, of course. I'm not basing it on the verse, of course. Actually, when somebody reviews you, you have no chance to actually answer. It's reviewed. You're happy to get a review. So I could review his review, but I didn't get that opportunity. But the point is, it's a literary effect. The connection between the nachash and Amalek is not based on this verse. It's based on the reality that they are both the eternal enemy of God and of the human being. And in the case of Amalek, I would add, they start with Israel first. And they both attack you at the weakest point. Because that's exactly when Amalek did attack us in chapter 17 of the book of Exodus. Right? We were traveling on the road and we're complaining. First, we complain about the water. Then we complain about the food. There's no food. And then the third time, we complain again about the water, Masa Umariva. And the place was called Masa Umariva, the place of quarrel, of dispute. Because the people said, Ayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu l'mayim. Is God in that presence in our midst or not? People don't know after God has given us water already and saved us, and the plagues and crossing the sea, and the manna falling from heaven. And we come to a place where there's no water, and the people say, is God in that presence or not? Next verse, Vayavo Amalek. That's when Amalek comes. So Amalek comes at moments of weakness, and especially if one reads the verse in Dvarim, that V'lo Yoreh Elohim to refer to Israel, as opposed to Amalek, it's unclear actually. And that's also a kind of weakness. They attack you at moments of weakness. What kind of weakness? Could be fear. It could be anxiety about where's the next meal coming from. It could be doubts about God, doubts about God's providence. There are many possibilities. It could be physical weariness and tiredness. And that's an opportunity for Amalek. They bite you that's the snake. They bite you with the heel. They attack you at the weakest point. So Amalek is one of the instantiations of the nachash. So I did want to say a few words about Amalek, and I'll just speak briefly about Amalek, and then I'll take comments and questions. To the question that I see in the chat, how is Eve weak? Just because she is the woman, the weaker sex? No. I already responded to that, but since you asked the question, I'll answer it a second time, which is, in the book of Genesis, we are hard-pressed to see the women of Genesis as in any sense weak. They're certainly not weak in the book of Bereshit. I wouldn't call Rebecca weak, and I wouldn't call Sarah weak. I wouldn't call Rachel weak, actually. But the woman is not weak, but the woman is the target for the snake for a different reason. Of course, some Midrashim see her as a sexual desire. But I think that the better interpretation, to me more plausible, is we have to remember that the woman was actually never commanded not to eat. She knows of the command, that's true, but she was never commanded. So there's a better chance if you go to the person that was never commanded, you got a better shot that they will violate the command. And in fact, when God speaks to Adam, God says to Adam, did you eat of the fruit that I commanded you not to eat of? So God actually, when it comes to Adam, mentions the command. When it comes to the Isha, God never says, I commanded you, because God never commanded her. She was created after the command. So there she knows of the command, and so he obtains for her, no doubt, but she was never commanded. So therefore, he's getting a much better shot with the Isha. In any event, let me come back to the Garden of Eden now and the snake. and raise two possibilities in the context of Amalek about what the snake represents. And then I'll take comments and questions. As I mentioned, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, there are two ways to understand the Garden of Eden. Let's put it like this, the snake, let's call it evil. There are two ways to see evil in the world. One way is to see evil as a function of essentially human behavior. That when bad things happen, it's what Eov's friend said to him, if you're suffering, you must have sinned, because suffering is a function of sin. And for the friends of Eov, I'm not sure we want such friends, but for these friends who come initially to console him, there is no other reason except for sin. That's one way to read it. The other way to read or to understand is to say that, yes, human beings may be responsible for many of the maladies of the world, but they're part of the reason, part of the answer, but not necessarily all of the answer. One might say that evil is built into creation. The snake, where's the snake coming from? Sounds like the snake pre-exists the human being, and it doesn't sound like the human being has anything to do with this nachash. So if we see the nachash as God's counterpart, God's evil, not evil twin, but evil compatriot, then we have a different understanding of the Torah and a different understanding of the world. And in point of fact, as I believe I mentioned in the first session, in chapter 1, you can read chapter 1 of the Torah in two very different ways. You can read chapter 1 as God creates a perfectly ordered world out of the chaos. And once God creates this world in 6 days and rests on the seventh, there is no chaos. Chaos is completely and totally eliminated. That's one way to read it. That was Kasuto. And there's another way to read it, especially in light of other texts, that God does place an order upon the world, but it doesn't fully eliminate the chaos, the disorder, the tohu vavohu. There's still the tohu vavohu, there's still the choshech al pnei tahom, there's still the tanin. And what the snake is simply the tanin who knows how to fight with God, not through force, but through guile. These are two very different readings of the first chapter of the Torah. And even Kasuto concedes that though in chapter 1 he reads it as a perfect ordering, there are other texts within the Bible that suggest that there's a disorder in the world from the beginning of time, and that God has not necessarily fully removed the disorder or the other forces, either because God chose not to, or because God can't. That's a good question, but that is another way to read the Chumash. And now we come to Amalek, and the question is how to read Amalek. The Torah says in chapter 17, there's a war of God against Amalek in every generation. Well, if God is fighting Amalek in every generation, we have to presume that Amalek's got to be pretty powerful if the fight against Amalek is in every single generation. And there are two ways to read Amalek. One way is to see Amalek as a product of human sin. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayit. Is God in our presence or not? After all that God has done for us, the people still doubt. And Vayavu Amalek. So Amalek comes as a response to human sin, to human error, to human, one might say, doubt, which is unacceptable doubt. After all the plagues and all the miracles and the sea and the man from heaven, and still, is God with us or not? Okay, one can read that as a failing, as a failure. And Vayavu Amalek. That's one way to read Amalek. There's another way to read Amalek, and that is to see Amalek actually, if you look at the context of Amalek, the context of Amalek is chapter 17 of Exodus. And if you think about chapter 17, I spoke about this in my prayer class the other day, that actually chapter 15 of the Torah is the Song of the Sea. And in chapter 15, God drowns Israel's adversaries. God drowns the Egyptians. And the Israelites who are crossing to the other side are singing together the song of praise to God, who's their Redeemer. And the last words of the song, Hashem Yimloch Yolam Va'ed, God will reign forever. Hashem Yimloch Yolam Va'ed. Very central verse that appears in many of our prayers. And in that Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, it describes the response of the nations of the world to Israel's deliverance. Shamu Amim Yirgazun, Chil Achaz Yoshvei Purashet, Az Nivalu Alufei Adom, Elei Moab Yochazei Murad, Nomogu Kol Yoshvei Canaan, Tipo Aleim Emata Vafachat. So the Torah in the Song of the Sea, 7 different words of fear. 7 different words of fear. Yirgazun, Rogez, Chil, Behala, Ra'ad, Namogu, Ema, and Pachad. 7 words, the whole world is trembling. And that idea of the world is trembling. We left Egypt, we're delivered from Egypt, and the world is trembling. The whole world is shaking. And reminds us of the book of Joshua, Sefer Yoshua, what Rachav the prostitute says to the spies. Everybody's afraid of you. No mogul kol yoshvei haaretz, because of what happened at the sea. The whole world is shaking. And what's interesting is, a chapter and a half later, Vayavo Amalek. There's one group that's not shaking. And they fight Israel, and they attack Israel. And in attacking Israel, they are in fact questioning God. Because the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, made the point that the deliverance of Israel is testimony to the world that God is the Redeemer, that God can vanquish Mitzrayim, that God can vanquish evil. And the whole world is shaking. It's Vayavo Amalek. So Amalek then, if you look in the context of the Song of the Sea, Amalek is the piece of existence that doesn't accept God's sovereignty. Hashem Yimloch Yolam Va'ed. That's the last words of the Song of the Sea. But the last words of the Amalek episode in chapter 17, Ki Yod al Kes Yah, Milchama Hashem B'Amalek Midar Dar, the last verse of Exodus, chapter 17. Yod al Kes Yah, the hand upon the throne, a war of God against Amalek in every generation. And here the important point to add to this understanding of the context of Amalek is the following. I actually talked about this, I wrote about it in my book on the Megillah. And that is that the Song of the Sea is about the Egyptians chasing Israel. That's for certain. But the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, recalls for the reader, and certainly recalled for the reader of ancient times, I have no doubt, the mythic battles that are described in all the other texts of the ancient Near East. In all the texts of the ancient Near East, there is in the beginning of creation, there's a war between forces. And these forces have names. They typically are creatures of the deep. One is called Tiamat, or in our language, Tahom. One is called Tanin. We're familiar with Tanin, the serpent. Tanin is one of the great gods of the deep. One of them is called Yam, another great god of the deep. Shirat Hayam, Kivasus Paro B'Nichmo U'Befarashav Bayam, Vayashiv Hashem Aleichem Et Mei Hayam, U'Vnei Yisrael Hochu Bayam B'Shah B'Toch Hayam. And not only that, not only does the Shirat Hayam emphasize the Yam, but Tahom, Tiamat or Tahom is also there. Tahomot B'Lev Yam. Tahomot B'Lev Yam. It's as if one can read it as that the description of the Song of the Sea is God uses these forces for God's own purposes. There are other forces out there, but there's this God, Hashem, who's able to control these forces, not just to suppress them, but actually to use them for God's own purpose. For those that read my commentary on the Megillah, I had a very interesting suggestion. I can't get into it fully now, but I'll mention it. It's in Hebrew, and not a simple Hebrew. I didn't write it. My colleague writes up my stuff. It's very good writing. The question I raised in the Megillah, one of the chapters is God in the Megillah? It's a good question. I mean, God is not mentioned explicitly in the Megillah at all. Is God there at all? How do you read the Megillah? In my book, I suggest three possibilities. God's not there. God is there, but in the background. And the third possibility is God is not only there, but God occupies center stage, which is very counterintuitive, I would say. And I argue for that, that's a plausible reading of the Megillah. They're all plausible. Can't get into all the details of it. But in suggesting that, I'm not going to go through all the evidence what I think is evidence, that is a potential reading. But everybody knows that in the Megillah, the heroes, there were two heroes in the Megillah, Mordechai and Esther. Now, Mordechai and Esther, those two names are very striking, because Mordechai and Esther, obviously, anybody who studied anything about the ancient Near East knows that the great god of the ancient Near East is named Marduk, and his consort is named Astarte, which is Esther. So Marduk and Astarte are the two great gods of the ancient Near East. And my suggestion is that a potential reading of the Megillah is that Hashem uses these two people, and the two people recall, actually, they are two people, but the names recall the names of the great powers of the ancient Near East, that God uses them to vanquish God's enemy. It's God's fight. It's not our fight. We're just pawns in God's fight. God has an enemy. Who is God's enemy? Mortal enemy. God's enemy, of course, is Amalek, which of course is Haman. And Haman is the perfect Amalekite, by the way, because he does exactly what Amalek always does. He picks on the weak. As he says himself, there's one nation, scattered and dispersed. And not only that, they don't even have their own land. There are 127 Medinot, but the Jews have no Medina. And if they don't have no Medina, they're easy prey. That's what Haman says. They can't defend themselves. They can't defend themselves. So therefore, it doesn't pay to keep them alive. So God is entering into battle against Amalek, and God uses, one might say, that's a potential reading. It's not the only reading, but it's a potential. I mention that here because that is a way to read Shirat Hayam, that God is using the Yam, and God is using the Tahom, not just that this God can suppress the Yam and Tahom, but that these forces, which are real and they really exist, but God is able to use them for God's own particular purposes. And if you read it that way, then what is Amalek? Then Amalek is the piece of existence that God has not succeeded to control. As God says, a war against Amalek in every generation. As I said before, either because God chooses not to, that I say is the conventional response. The Ramban says it explicitly. The Ramban's the one who says there are these other forces out there. They really exist against the Rambam, who thought they were a figment of our imagination. No, they really exist. But for whatever reason, God has chosen to give them some freedom, some license. A more radical view, which I don't think you'll find in classical Judaism, but it's certainly a logical possibility, is not that maybe within the Zohar you have it, or the Kabbalah, some of the more radical Kabbalistic texts, I'm sure, suggest this, that it's not that God chooses not to suppress them, it's that God is also involved in a struggle in which the human being may actually participate, according to some Kabbalistic texts. In doing mitzvot and doing this, we are helping God. I mean, the Rambam would say that is heresy. Okay, but in any event, whatever the Rambam might think about that, but that's a separate question. But in point of fact, you can read the Amalek story exactly that way. It's the piece that God has not succeeded for whatever reason to control. And this takes us back actually to the basic question in the first chapter of the Torah. One might even say in the first couple of verses of the Torah. The land, the existence is tov vavo v'choshech ha'pnei tahom. There you have the tov and vo. There you have the tahom. And God actually succeeds in ordering the chaos. But has God fully ordered the chaos, as Casuto argues, or there's a book by John Levinson, I forget, it's called Something and the Persistence of Evil, where he argues quite the opposite. He argues for reading of chapter 1 even, that God has not really fully succeeded in controlling the chaos. Whatever you make of chapter 1 of the Torah, I think it's clear that there are other texts of the Torah, and I argue that you have the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is suggesting pretty strongly that there are these other forces. I would say it's almost explicit in a verse such as, Mi chamocha ba'elim Hashem, mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh. Who was like you, ba'elim? And the simple reading of it is gods, or all-powerful beings, but you are more powerful. And that's what God said Moshe should say to Paro. You want to know who I am? There is none like me. Ein kamoni. Ein kamoni means there are others, but they're not like me. I'm more powerful than they are. So the book of Exodus certainly can be read as a book which presupposes that there are all these different forces out there. There may be one force more powerful than the others, but God, as God says, and I will do war against the gods of Egypt. One can read the plagues exactly that way. The 9th plague of darkness. Ra is the sun god of Egypt. So one can read it that way. And I think it's quite legitimate reading. In any event, our interest here is not explaining the book of Exodus per se, but our interest here is to point out that the snake lives on. The snake lives on in different forms, and the chief form of the snake, of course, is Amalek, who attacks you at the weakest point. Let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions, and and then we'll continue. But if anybody has comments or questions or whatever, happy to hear it. By the way, I mentioned, and I mention every week, that if we don't have time to get to all the questions, or you think of something afterwards, you can always email me at dsilber@risha.org, and I'm very happy to get those emails. Some of you have done it, and it's great. Now, you should feel that you can email me if you have a comment, question, disagreement, or whatever it is. I try to respond. Okay.
If you say that the snake is an enemy, let's say, of God and of man, and I see that in the punishment, it's snake versus man, or snake versus humanity. Where does God address that he was really directing it versus God?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I presume that to be God's punishment, because after all, you live in the afar, you live in the dust. You have to remember that the afar in the Genesis verses represent death. You are a human being. God said to Adam, you are dust, and you return to dust. Afar atav yel afar tashuv. So the snake is, one might say, living. Snake lives in is kind of death in life, is what the snake is being told. If God's punishment, ultimate punishment, or definition of the human is limited, nothing's more limiting than death. So the snake is dead even when the snake lives. Reminds me very much of what we say about I think about this all the time, the statement in the Talmud that it's tzaddikim, even when they're dead, are actually alive. Think about this all the time. In terms of looking at the Yesh Kodesh the other day, he lives. I mean, he's alive. He's a holy man. He's alive. But the snake is afar tochal kol yemei chayecha, which means the punishment of the human. Okay, the human's alive someday, returning to dust. But you, snake, even when you're alive, you dwell in the dust. So I would say that's God's direct response to the snake. And then the human side is you bite them at the heel, but they'll smash you in the head. Yeah. Someone else had a comment here? Is that it, Noah?
There are a couple other questions in the chat.
Go ahead.
One, will you ever release your English version of your book on the Megillah?
Well, I have to write it first, you know. If it gets written, if I could write well, I would have written it in the first place in English. I write my books because I want people to read them. I don't make a living from it, you know. So the point is, and the proceeds all go to Drisha, actually. So it's, you know, I get paid. I mean, I'm supported in these books. I've been supported, all my 3 books. We had donors who supported. The book of the Megillah was supported by the Belfer Wiener family, you know, the Belfer family. And I think Linda's even in the class. Yeah, Linda's here with an L, I see. Yeah, so people support it. People want to get my stuff out there. They support the book. But I would like it to get it to English just because I want people to read it. I think the interesting ideas that we can engage with. I think the idea, like we do here, we engage with ideas, put ideas out there, and we think about it. The problem with a book is that once you write it, it's sort of fixed. Whereas in the class, I can come back 3 weeks later and say, you know, I said something 3 weeks ago, and I'm thinking about it, and someone commented, and I think we could do better. So that's the advantage of learning together. You can always revisit, reformulate, correct, etc. New ideas. But having said that, the book has a value, I think, in putting it out there to a broader public. So if I write it, I'd like to. Yeah, that's really not a question about the class, but okay, that's an advertisement. Yeah, what else?
Debbie, you had another question. I don't know if you feel like it's been answered well enough or if it's to ponder.
How can we say that God can't do something?
Well, we can say whatever we want. I mean, it depends how one understands God. Look, here's the point. It's pretty clear when you look at the Bible, I would say, before you come to the Rambam, before you come to the Tosh Peh, when you just open up the Chumash, it's pretty clear to me that there are other forces out there. In fact, the Torah pretty much says it explicitly. There are other powers there, but as far as Jews are concerned, you're not allowed to get involved with them. You know, all the sun, the moon, and the stars, Asher Chalak Hashem. God has set them apart for the other nations.
Right.
And when the Torah speaks about witchcraft, divination, sorcery,
Right.
You can't do it. Tamim tiyeh. It's not for you. You have prophecy. You shouldn't do those things, but not because, as the Rambam thought, they're phony. One does not get a sense in reading the Bible that these things have no power to them. Not at all. Maybe they're not as foolproof as prophecy. They're not as powerful. They are off limits to us. That's what the Torah says. You Jews can't get involved in this stuff, but not because it has no efficacy. I mean, when speaking
it
of
was
the snake,
Bilam.
What? Bilam? Even in terms of the Tanin, when Aaron goes with Moshe and he changes his mate into a Tanin, and the Egyptians have their Khartoumim, and they also do it. Okay, Aaron's staff swallows up theirs. But there's no sense in the Bible, I think, whether it's the Balat Ov in the book of Shmuel, Bilam, there's no sense whatsoever, I think, that in the Bible, that these other forces don't exist. Again, God's relationship to the other forces, God may have more power, but there is certainly not a sense. And I think we just got to be aware of the fact that different people have, I'll give you another example of it. I'll take 1 more minute for the question. That's probably a very important question, but for example, say for example, the question, if you believe in one God who is all good, who is all powerful, and who is all knowing, then the question is, how do you account for the world in which we live? That's a big, sort of a basic question that every religion asks. And I think most thinking people ask the same question. And different people have different answers. The Ralbag has partially answers by saying, it's not true that God knows everything that's going to happen. There are limits on what God can know. That's his approach. Okay, many other Jewish thinkers reject that. But my point is, there's a problem, and he's trying to resolve the problem. He's trying to solve the problem. And it's important to remember that even something like Bible criticism, is simply trying to answer the same questions that the classical Mefarshim are trying to answer. The text raises many questions, and there are different ways to go about answering the questions. One way is they're two different texts, and they're two different opinions. Another way is to try to reconcile. So, I don't want to go, but what can you, but the Rambam believe that some things are out of bounds, and it may be the case, but it's not the case that people haven't thought this. And I would say within the Kabbalistic text, you have a lot more, there's a lot more daring and a lot more freedom to express ideas that many people may think, so. Yes, there's one more. Lauren, do you have a question there? Thought that Lauren had a question. No? She seems to have disappeared off the screen. Okay, fine. Let's continue now then. All right. So let me make just another point about the snake. Lauren Merkin. Yes. Do you see her there? I see Lauren Merkin's head, but no one's talking.
Oh, unmute. There I am. I didn't know how to make it work. I
yes,
apologize.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
If God created it all, why did he create evil?
That's a good question. We did those kinds of questions. In other words, did God create? This is the question that the Kabbalists raise, okay? I keep going back to the Kabbalists because they ask ultimate questions. And that's the Ari, Shviras HaKelim. The Kabbalists explain it, not that I understand it. Something takes place in the beginning, if we can talk about beginning of time. Something takes place at some point, and when creation happens, there's something that's spun off from creation. He calls the breaking of the vessels. There's something that's spun off, which we would call evil. And it's part and parcel of existence. It's not a function of what people do. It simply is it's a fact, and perhaps someday we'll get rid of the evil, or someday we will be able to incorporate it properly within our being, which will lead me to the next topic of, is this snake something internal, part of us, if it's simply an external enemy? But the Kabbalists try to deal with this, but however we understand it, it's not a function. This is the important part of it. It's not at least wholly a function. It's not wholly a function of human mistake, human error. It is a ontological reality for the Kabbalists. And that's what Gershom Shalom thought was the great power of Jewish mysticism, which is it takes evil very seriously. It's not something that really doesn't exist. It's a product of human error. No, it exists apart from humanity. It exists before humanity was even there. So that's where it comes from, the great mystery. The Ari called it the breaking of the vessels. But again, this is not my area of expertise. I sometimes co-teach with Nathaniel Berman. He could tell us more about different schools of Kabbalistic thought. But what it comes down to, bottom line, is that they see it as part of the act of creation. In the beginning, it exists, it predates the human being. And that's, I think, and that's an important point, because it's about how we see our world. It's what it's really about. That's what myth is. Myth is a way of seeing the world. And the Kabbalistic way of seeing the world is taking evil very seriously as not wholly a function of human mistake. By the way, I wanted to mention one other point, and next week we'll have to pick up more with Amalek, but I did want to mention something else about the snake. And that is that we have a story later on, because one of the questions, of course, in terms of the nachash, is it simply this external bad guy? Or is the nachash ultimately to be understood as part and parcel of what it means to be human? So I do want to make the argument that, and I'm talking about reading the Bible now. I'm not talking about other kinds of texts, Hasidic texts and stuff like that. They certainly, within the Hasidic text, certainly suggest that. But I want to argue that within the classical, just the Bible, just the Torah, we can make a similar argument. But I didn't want to make one point about the snake. And that is that there's a story later on in the Chumash, very strange story. And that is that in the 21st, I think it's chapter 20 or 21, let me see. We just check that out. It's in the book of Bamidbar. Yes, it's chapter 21. Chapter 21 in the book of Bamidbar says the following story. It's chapter 21, beginning in verse number 4, very famous and puzzling story. So Israel is traveling through the desert. They just had a war against the Canaanites, king of Arad, whom they defeat, which suggests to the reader that we're talking about a new generation. The generation that leaves Mitzrayim dies in chapter 20. And in chapter 21, we have the children, the new generation. And they have a victory against Canaan. Fine. And then they're traveling along. Vayisu meharahar derech yamsuf lisbov et eretz edom vatiktzar nefesh ha'am baderech. As they're traveling to go to the land, they're going around the land of Edom, because Edom did not give us permission to enter, to go through their land. They ask permission, Edom refuses, so they're circumventing Edom. And the people are losing patience. But tiktzar nefesh, or katzar means brief or short. They're growing restive. They're losing their patience, this new generation. Vayidaber ha'am be'elohim u'v'Moshe. And the people spoke against God and against Moshe. Why did you take us out of Egypt? To die in the desert? We have no bread, we have no water. And we are sick and tired of this miserable food, which is the man. We don't want the man. Why did we leave Egypt? To walk around the desert and starve? So God sent against the people the nachashim hasrafim, the seraph, the serpents. A saraf, which means a burning fire, is a synonym for a nachash. Here they're called nechashim srafim. Vayinashchu et ha'am, and they bit the people. Vayamot am rav mi Yisrael, and many of Israel died. Vayavo ha'am el Moshe, vayamu chatanu. So the people go to Moshe and they say, we sinned. Ki dibarnu b'Hashem, we spoke against you, God, and we spoke against you. Hitpalel Hashem, pray to God. V'yoser mi'oleinu et hanachash, God should remove the nachash. V'yitpalel Moshe b'yad ha'am, and Moshe prays for the people. V'yomer Hashem el Moshe, aseh l'cha saraf v'simoto al nes. God said to Moshe, make for yourself a saraf figure and place him on a banner. Whoever is bit will see this, called a serpent, and live. So Moses made a bronze snake, and Moshe placed it on a banner. And whoever was bit by the snake, the person would look at the bronze snake, and he would live. The story, it's not necessary to say this, but I'll say it anyway. The story is a very strange and puzzling story. No one can possibly read this without raising a bunch of questions. So first of all, let me just make a couple of points about the nachash hanachoshet. Maybe we'll have a chance to revisit it. I myself am puzzled by the story, but I'm going to make a couple of observations about the nachash hanachoshet. Before I get to the nachash hanachoshet, I want to make a different point here. That the complaint over here, this is a very important point, by the way. The complaint in chapter 21 is not the complaint we find earlier in the Torah. Because the complaints before chapter 21 are a different complaint. The complaint before chapter 21 is, we would have been better off in Egypt. Why did you take us out of Egypt for? There's no point. What, to starve us? Leave us alone. We'd rather die in Egypt. Or they say, take us back to Egypt. Let's get a new leader. Let's go back to Mitzrayim. This sounds like the same complaint, but it's not the same complaint. It's different. This complaint, I believe, is, why did you take us out of Egypt to die in the desert? We have no food. We're eating the man. It's a different complaint. The complaint is, why are you moving us around in circles? Why are we circumventing and moving around and around? Let's get to our destination already. and they just had defeated the Canaanites. These people don't want to go back to Egypt. By the way, why would they want to go back to Egypt? They were never in Egypt. This is a new generation. They were never there. I mean, take us back to the homeland. They were never there. Egypt for them is a foreign country. They grew up in the desert. It's not about going back to Egypt. It's that, what are you stalling for? What are we going in circles? Let's just go. And that is actually very typical of the second generation. The first generation have the slave mentality. Their problem is they're too dependent on others. But the second generation, they got a different problem. They see themselves as totally self-sufficient. And they're not willing to recognize that whatever good came to them is to some extent a product of someone else, whether it's God's assistance or their ancestors or whatever. That we benefit from those who have come before us. So that's the complaint. And over here, so they speak against God, they speak against Moshe, and God sends the snakes, the nachashim asrafim. I want to make 2 points, which are very important points. One is that the text in the Torah picks up on something that we find elsewhere in the prophetic writings. I mentioned one of them, I think, in this class. I think it was Psalm 140, where there the nachash is mentioned, and the snake is described as the one who actually slanders. The snake's power is in the lashon. And the point over here is the sin of the people is described here in chapter 21. Vayidaber ha'am, the people spoke against God and Moses. And when the people confess their sin, they say, Chatanu, ki dibarnu b'Hashem vavach. Because we spoke against you, we spoke against God. So the power of the idea of this misspeaking, actually, the power of language, the power of the word. That's the snake. And after all, how did God create the world if not through speech? Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Elohim Yihiyar, Vayiyar. So the snake attacks God in terms of the speech. It's interesting that we have the concept in our own Bible, and of course you have it in many places, the snake charmer, right? What is the snake charmer called in biblical Hebrew? The verse in Kohelet, Im yishoch hanachash b'lo lachash, v'yein yitron reval harashon. Wonderful verse in Kohelet, I believe it's chapter 10. If the snake bites below lachash without a charm, the snake charmer hasn't had the opportunity to utter the charm. Then what advantage does the one who can speak have? If you don't know how to use speech, if it's not used effectively, but what's interesting is that the charmer who can defeat, who can quiet the snake, is called a nachash, a whisperer. Yeah, it's a horse whisperer. It's a snake whisperer. So the power of the snake is in the language. Yes, the snake can bite you with the heel also, but the real danger of the snake, of the nachash, in that first story, is not biting anybody. It's the way the snake speaks. Okay, that's point number one. And here you have it over here, that the nachash, the power of speech, the danger of speaking ill, and the power that speech has, was never more evident, I think, than in our own time when we have the internet. Put something on the internet and the whole world sees it, and you can never take it back. So you see the power of language, danger. That's one point. But there's something else I wanted to mention here. And I think we'll next week pick up with this question about, just give me 2 more minutes here. I want to pick up next week with the question of whether the snake is actually also to be seen as something within ourselves. And what's interesting is that Moses prays for the people and God answers, but God's answer is not what the people had wanted, right? Because what did the people say to Moshe? They said to Moshe, Moshe, you pray for us. V'yaser me'aleinu et hanachash, and remove the snake. So they want the snakes to disappear. But that's not what God actually, says. What God says is something different. What God says is there will be snakes. I can't remove the nachash. There will always be nachashim, but there's a way to overcome the snake. And what's striking is the way to overcome the snake, and we'll talk about this, I don't know if we'll get to this next week, is very interesting. By looking, if it's by looking at the bronze snake, you overcome the snake. But let me simply point out, leaving that on the side for a moment, that the story of looking at the bronze snake as a way of quelling the snake has as a parallel in the Mishnah of Rosh Hashanah. For those who did the Daf Yomi, you encountered the Mishnah just a short while ago. And the Mishnah talks about two cases. The Mishnah says about this story, can the snake actually cure you? No. When Israel would look up towards the heavens, they would be healed. And there's another story the Mishnah has before that. When Moses would raise his hands up to heaven, Israel would be victorious. When his hands would fall down, Amalek would be victorious. Do the hands of Moses matter? Says the Mishnah. No. When Moses prays, when Israel looks towards Moses on high and prays with Moses, then they're victorious. So what's interesting in the Mishnah already, the Mishnah saw these two stories as parallel. The first is actually Amalek. The second is the nachash. So already you see in the Mishnah, whatever we make of the pshat there, but the Mishnah already understood that the nachash and Amalek are actually to be read together. And just as Amalek is always there, the nachash in its many forms is always there. That's what God said to Moses. Moses said, remove the nachash. I can't remove the nachash, says God. I can teach you a way to deal with the nachash through prayer. But I'm not going to remove the nachash because the nachash is always present. So that's as far as this week is concerned. I'll take a couple of questions, comments, and then next week we'll deal with this question about should we see the nachash as purely external or within the biblical text, the Torah? Does the Torah suggest that the nachash is actually part of ourselves? Now, as far as the question I saw, I think Gitti had a question about the word yeshuvcha. She wonders if the word yeshuvcha and the word safa, which is language, are actually connected. I don't know that. That's a very good question. I will say something else about yeshuvcha, though, which is related to language. If you think about a story, thank you for the question, because it gives me an opportunity now to say something which is related. If you think about a story, someone mentioned this earlier. If you think about a story which represents the power of language to harm, there is one such story, actually, which stands out above all other stories. And of course, we all know this. It's the story of Bilam, right? It's the story of Bilam. Bilam is hired to curse. He's not hired to fight. He's hired to curse. Of course, the story of Bilam follows right after. It's chapter 22. The nachash and nechoshet in the beginning of the conquest is Bamidbar, chapter 21. I mention this for the following reason. Bilam is hired to curse. We know the story, great story. And God will transform the curse into a blessing. And when Bilam goes off by himself to meditate or to consider how Bilam will in fact curse the Jews. And we have a very interesting word, a very difficult word. Bilam is hired in chapter 22. Let me see if I can find this verse. If I can find this verse, let's see. Just give me 1 minute. So he sets out in chapter 22. 1 second. Give me 1 minute if I can find this. Otherwise, I'll simply record it without finding the text, but I'd like to find it. I found it. It's chapter 23. He's about to curse the Jews. He's about to curse, he thinks. So he instructs Balak, chapter 23, build me 7 altars and bring me the animals, 7 parim, shiva elim. Balak builds the altars. And Bilam says to Balak, you wait here. I'm going to go. I'm going to walk away. Ulai yikareh Hashem likvati. Perhaps God will meet me. Udvar ma'yareni. God will show me something. V'igadatilach. He goes off. Vayelech shefi. It's a word that appears in no other place. Vayelech shefi. So the JPS says Vayelech shefi. He went off alone. And of course, Vayelech shefi, others to a bare height. Exact meaning of Hebrew, uncertain. It is certainly uncertain. Vayelech shefi means, but I think there's a strong suggestion in the text that Vayelech shefi can certainly be connected to Hu Yishuv Charosh V'Ata Tishufenu Akev. So Bilam is the power of the snake, the power of the curse, the power of the language, right? And the snake tries to reduce Israel to the level of the snake, tries to bring us to the level of the snake. What is the level of the snake? It's what God said, or Rurata, you are the most cursed. And the most cursed tries to bring the curse to involve others also, to bring the curse upon others. At this point, at least, God intervenes on our behalf and changes the curse into a blessing. Okay, so this is as far as this week. If people have comments or questions, I will send me an email, dsilber@risha.org, or we'll pick it up next week. The last session is this nachash, an internal or purely external force.
Rabbi Silber, can I ask a quick question or just
Yes.
let people? I remember as my husband Ezra once quoting something or saying something that it says vayishalach. It doesn't say vayishlach. And he drew a distinction possibly that one is to release and one is to send. And if it's indeed to release, it plays to your point that the nechashim are always there.
Right.
They were
very
just
interesting
released.
question, actually. Yeah. It's very interesting. I just had recently a conversation with someone exactly about that point about vayishlach and then the PL form of vayishalach. Yeah, I mean it's a very good point. One would have to look at many different. The word appears many times actually. Sometimes vayishalach is you send them to a certain place, not expecting them to come back. Sometimes I just think it's an expression of something much more forceful. But what's interesting is that the nachash in this particular case is actually being sent by God. It's not that they're going off on their own. Vayishalach does suggest to us that God has some control over them, or at least can direct them, but they are there actually. They're present and God is directing them in this particular case. So it's
Right.
an interesting question. Yeah.
Right. They're being released, but they're there.
They're there.
You know, the evil is there.
Right.
It's just being,
It's certainly right. I think one can make a very strong case that in the plain reading of the Torah, the evil is there. And it's just a question.
That's what I'm saying. It reinforces you're there.
We deal with Amalek next time. We'll see about the evil may be there, but there may be ways to protect ourselves from the evil, or there may be situations in which we make ourselves much more vulnerable to evil. And we'll talk about that next week, but the main focus will be on is Amalek external or internal. So thank you very much. Looking forward to next week.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber, as always, for a wonderful, fascinating class. And thank you to everyone here for your participation, for your contributions, and for being part of our learning community. It really makes it what it is. We continue to have classes next week. There will be sort of a break for Thanksgiving in the sense that we won't have classes on Thanksgiving, but there will be classes happening Thanksgiving week and more classes starting up after. So please make sure to check out our website and hope to see you again soon.